When talking about medieval Europe, knights, castles, kings, nobles, merchants, and, of course, clergy members affiliated with the Catholic Church usually come to mind. All these elements played specific roles in the political and cultural evolution of medieval Europe, but in this context, we will focus more on the Catholic Church and clergy members. The Catholic Church was considered a spiritual authority in medieval Europe, and clergy members had an enormous influence on people's lives. This influence was not just the influence of religion, it was indeed the personal influence of clergy members. During that time, the Catholic Church was seen as the spiritual guide for individuals. Right and wrong were determined by the Church, and these established rules were not to be questioned. Priests affiliated with the Church were among the most influential figures shaping human life in the Middle Ages. Priests baptized people, performed marriages, facilitated confessions of sins, and managed families. People usually turned to priests to learn what they should do, often before consulting their families or friends. Therefore, the role of these priests in shaping society was of great importance. However, most of the population was illiterate at that time, and the situation was even more challenging when Latin, the language of the Bible, was involved. Almost the entire population could not access a single person who could read the Latin Bible throughout their lives. This person was usually their church's priest. This situation kept the teachings of the Bible away from the public, and people had no choice but to trust the words of their priests. They had no other option. With the establishment of the Papal States by the papacy from the 18th century onwards, the Catholic Church gained political importance in addition to its spiritual significance. However, corruption existed in the Church until this period, and from the 8th century onwards, this corruption became more apparent. By the approaching 15th century, when the Reform movement was imminent, the Pope, cardinals, and bishops within the Church were more concerned with their personal interests and secular needs than with the spiritual and religious needs of the people. During this period, two practices enriched the wealth of clergy members. First, the display of sacred relics in churches. In Christianity, the bones, garments, and belongings of apostles or saints were considered sacred relics. In the Middle Ages, many churches and chapels, especially pilgrimage centers, displayed sacred relics, and people who came to see them were expected to make a donation to the church. The intense interest of the public in sacred relics led each church to create its own collection of sacred relics over time. However, many of these were fake. The second practice was the sale of indulgences. According to Christian belief, people had to spend some time in purgatory after death to cleanse themselves of sins. According to the Catholic Church, this time could be shortened with certain prayers and rituals. People's only way to reduce the time they or their loved ones spent in purgatory and be liberated from this torment was to purchase several indulgence certificates. The display of these sacred relics and the sale of indulgences did not escape the attention of some European scholars, as these could only be read by Latin speakers and because the Catholic Church shaped religious matters according to its interpretation. The first objection to these practices came from two reformists, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. However, both were found guilty, and since Wycliffe had already died, his bones were exhumed and burned as part of his posthumous punishment. The oppressive attitude of the Catholic Church was not sufficient to suppress the Reform movement. A few years later, a man influenced by the ideas of Vitellius became the catalyst for one of the greatest conflicts that would unfold in the Western Church. This man was none other than Martin Luther. He was a law student at the prestigious University of Erfurt in Germany. According to various accounts, one day, caught in a violent storm while walking, he swore to become a monk if he survived the disaster. Luther emerged unscathed from the storm and, true to his vow, immediately left the law school and entered the St. Augustine Monastery in Erfurt. In 1505, he was sent to Rome by the papacy to attend the chapter of his affiliated monastery. Although the place dazzled the young man with its magnificent artworks, he soon noticed that something was amiss. Practices such as having to pay to see sacred relics and the sale of indulgences where clergy lived in wealth, seemed illogical to him. Shortly after his return from this journey, Luther was sent to Wittenberg University to continue his education. However, what he witnessed in Rome continued to trouble his mind. Through his research, Luther concluded that salvation could be attained solely through faith. He argued that the money collected under the pretext of sacred relics was not necessary for salvation. According to him, the best thing for a person was sola fide, Latin for faith alone. In 1516, a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel came to Germany to collect indulgences to finance the reconstruction of St. Peter's Church in Rome. For Luther, this was the last straw. Legend has it that on October 31, 1517, Luther nailed a document to the door of Wittenberg Church to initiate a discussion on the power and influence of indulgences, marking the first defiance against the papacy. This document would later be known as the 95 Theses because it comprised 95 points. However, historians argue that this event may never have occurred and that Luther merely sent the document to specific bishops. Regardless, Luther knew that day marked the beginning of an irreversible path. The 95 Theses spread across various regions of Europe rapidly through the help of the printing press. However, Luther's criticism of indulgences was perceived as a direct challenge to papal authority. For example, the 95th thesis stated, "I deny that the Pope has power over purgatory. If the Pope can release anyone from purgatory, why in the name of love does he not abolish purgatory altogether?" These critiques spurred papal authorities into action. In 1521, Luther was excommunicated from the church in front of the church by papal decree. In the same year, during the Diet of Worms, a diet held in the presence of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Luther was asked to defend his thoughts. However, Luther, stating that his ideas were wrong, refused, and shortly after the Diet of Worms, he was declared an outlaw. From that moment on, Luther continued his work in the mansion of Frederick the Wise, a Saxon noble who protected him. The first thing Luther did there was to translate the Bible into German. This allowed a large part of the German population to read the Bible in their own language for the first time. Concurrent with this period, when Luther's ideas spread rapidly in Germany, other clergy members advocating the Reform movement began to emerge in different parts of Europe. One of these clergy members was Huldrych Zwingli, a priest and philosopher who had been advocating church reform in Switzerland since 1519. Although Zwingli and Luther independently developed their ideas, they shared similar thoughts on many issues. Meanwhile, a reform movement had also begun in England. In 1534, King Henry VIII of England separated from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. The reform movements led to the diversification of religious ideas in Europe and a growing resistance against church authority. John Calvin, or Jean Calvin in full, moved to Geneva to continue his activities and spread his teachings. According to Calvin, religion should not be a tool of oppression or interest in the hands of rulers. It should only represent a connection between individuals and God. People should learn about religion by reading the Holy Scriptures, not by consulting the church or other institutions. According to Calvin, national governance and social order should be in line with the essence of Christians. These thoughts gained great popularity in Geneva. During his time in Geneva, Calvin had the opportunity to implement these ideas by establishing a model church consisting of selected priests and by promoting language learning principles while increasing the number of schools. Consequently, Geneva became an important center for Protestant scholars. During his time in Geneva, Calvin dealt with issues related to the city's governance and education, but he also faced opposition from those who disagreed with his views. His attitude was not always peaceful, and he could adopt a stern approach towards those with whom he disagreed on certain issues. During this period, while Calvin was governing Geneva, an incident occurred where a Spanish-speaking man was condemned to death by burning in 1533 for publicly spreading his views. This reflects a time when Calvin, criticizing authorities for using religion to exert pressure on people, attempted to exert influence in society through similar methods. Although Calvin's ideas resonated in various regions of Europe, such as Germany, Scotland, Ireland, England, France, and the Netherlands, his followers came to be known as Calvinists, while Luther's followers were referred to as Lutherans. Luther and Calvin were not initially intending to create a new denomination. Their goal was to reform certain practices in the Church. For example, their reformist demands included the abolition of indulgence sales and making the Bible accessible to everyone. However, the refusal of both sides to compromise led to the fragmentation of the Western Church. Another interesting group that emerged during this period was the Anabaptists, originating from Switzerland. The Anabaptists held radical ideas for the time, such as being against military service, not using valuable possessions, and renouncing wealth. Moreover, they opposed the baptism of children at a certain age. The Anabaptists' views on baptism were based on the idea that an individual should decide on baptism after reaching adulthood. While this view may seem reasonable, both Catholics and Protestants vehemently opposed the Anabaptists' idea, leading to the exclusion of this group. The Reform movement was supported by many nobles in Europe, but the support was not solely for religious reasons. It was also political. Reformists wanted to break the feudal power on their lands and strengthen central authority. However, this process was not peaceful. Many people were killed, monasteries, churches, and artworks of religious significance were destroyed. One of the most striking episodes of the Reform movement occurred in England. King Henry VIII of England, displeased with the Pope's refusal to approve his marriages, separated from the Catholic Church and established his own church, the Church of England. This process initiated church reform in England and independence from papal authority. Additionally, events such as the closure of monasteries and the disposal of church properties took place during this period.